She was given in marriage to a man who did not love her, in a land where beauty was currency, and she had none to offer. The Earl received her with cold detachment. The child rejected her with silent disdain. And amid sealed letters, uneasy silences, and hidden truths, Rosamund learned to survive without surrendering her soul. But what happens when duty becomes unjust? And when a wounded heart begins, slowly, to see things differently? Welcome to a story where love does not arise from desire, but from sorrow, and blooms where no one ever expected. Tell me, from where are you listening to this story? And you, do you believe a woman can change the fate of an entire lineage? Thornborough, England, 1851. The village was still stirring beneath layers of morning mist and distant church bells when the black carriage of the Earl of Greystone Hall pulled up before the private chapel of the Ashcombe family. There was no music, no flowers. Only the faint scent of incense and the weary footsteps of two anonymous witnesses, servants summoned at the last minute to sign the marriage register. Not a single relative of the groom. Not even the forced smile of polite society. Just papers, silence, and a duty executed like a sentence. Rosamund Ashcombe stood beside the altar, as still as a dried cypress. Her gown, though new, lacked the sheen of imported silks or the tailoring of London fashion. It was a modest pearl-gray silk ensemble, with long sleeves and a high collar that concealed even the curve of her throat. The skirt, weighed down by old-fashioned embroidery, hung on her frame like lifeless armor. Her low chignon, carefully styled by a mute maid, revealed the angular lines of her face, a pronounced nose, thin lips, and pale gray eyes that dared not lift. Across from her, Lord Nathaniel Sterling signed without looking up. Tall, reserved, dressed in a black wool frock coat and boots still dusted from the road, he seemed more magistrate than husband. He said nothing beyond what protocol required. His dark green eyes never sought hers. His hand never brushed hers, not even when handing her the pen. Lady Honoria, Rosamund's aunt, observed from a side pew with an expression of composed indifference, like one watching a shameful wound finally close. For her, this union was a convenient solution, a plain and penniless niece joined to a powerful man whose reputation still walked a tightrope. The price had been a symbolic, nearly humiliating dowry, and the promise of social disappearance in favor of the new alliance. Rosamund did not cry. There were no tears that could alter the inevitable. Since childhood, she had learned that her face was a barrier to affection. At dances, she was hidden behind curtains. In family portraits, placed at the edge. Her wedding day would be no different. When the ceremony ended, the priest murmured a barely audible blessing. There was no kiss. Only a faint nod from the Earl and a quiet motion toward the waiting carriage. Outside, February's cold wind lifted the hem of Rosamund's dress and struck her face with a sharpness no crueler than the chapel they had just left behind. The journey to Greystone Hall was long and rough, over 3 hours in a closed carriage along frozen dirt roads. Inside, the silence was nearly sacred. Nathaniel stared out the window, arms crossed, brow furrowed. She sat opposite him, hands folded in her lap, clutching a handkerchief embroidered by her late mother. She did not speak. He offered no conversation. The horse's hooves echoed like drums of judgment. At one point, Rosamund lifted her gaze and studied him in secret. The Earl's profile was severe, marked by the shadow of an unshaven jaw and the weight of mourning left unresolved. He did not seem angry. He seemed absent, as though traveling back to another time, another face, another altar where there had been flowers and music. When the first cypress trees of the estate began to pierce the fog, Rosamund felt she was entering foreign ground. This was not her home. It would never be. Greystone Hall was a borrowed place, granted by name, not by desire. The handkerchief was damp in her grip. In her chest, a hollow ache was beginning to take shape. She was a married woman. A countess. But she was not welcome. The carriage halted. A footman opened the door with mechanical precision. Nathaniel stepped out first and, without offering his arm, walked directly to the main entrance. She descended alone. In the distance, among pillars and precisely trimmed hedges, figures watched her from the shadows. No one smiled. No one greeted her with flowers or words. As she climbed the stone steps, Rosamund felt for the first time the true weight of her new title, not on her shoulders but in her soul. The ugliness, she thought, was not in her face. It was in the eyes of those who never learned how to see. And as she crossed the threshold, she knew, without being told, that this house still mourned another woman. A beautiful woman. A dead woman. She was merely the replacement. The face no one wanted. The name no one would celebrate. The plain bride of a widowed earl. And the contract had only just begun. Greystone Hall rose from the mist like an ancient promise that had long forgotten its meaning. Gray stone, high gables, tall windows like narrowed eyes peering into the past, and a silence not born of peace, but of unresolved grief. It was a manor built on symmetry and severity, shaped by the discipline of those who ruled and the silence of those who served. Rosamund crossed the threshold accompanied only by her shadow, and the weight of her new surname, the Countess of Greystone Hall. A social fiction barely sustained by her slight frame, her unadorned face, and the hushed murmurs of the servants who watched from the side gallery without making any effort to conceal their curiosity. To her left, a middle-aged footman with a sharp nose and measured steps took her luggage without a word. To her right, two maids exchanged a glance as if they'd rehearsed it for days, an almost imperceptible smirk and a fleeting smile that vanished the moment Rosamund turned her gaze toward them. No one called her milady. No one addressed her as Countess. In this place she did not yet exist. Nathaniel walked a few paces ahead, never once looking back. His upright figure, cloaked in a dark wool frock coat and wearing a mid-brimmed hat he hadn't bothered to remove indoors, looked more like that of a landowner inspecting his estate than a husband leading his new wife. Upon reaching the grand vestibule, he stopped. Turning with an air of formality, he looked at her as if she were a temporary guest. "Rooms have been prepared for you in the south wing," he said curtly. "They're away from the children's quarters and the private rooms. If you need anything, speak to Jacinta. She'll provide what is sufficient." Sufficient? Not what was needed. Not what was kind. Just sufficient. As if feeding a wounded bird with stale crumbs, not to help it fly but simply to keep it alive. Rosamund lowered her gaze and nodded quietly. She had expected no more. It didn't hurt. Not that, at least. What did hurt was something else entirely, the way her presence seemed to disturb not even a speck of dust in that vast house. When the Earl left without another word, Rosamund stood alone beneath the golden light pouring through the tall windows. She slowly turned to observe the gallery. There hung the portraits of the Sterlings, ancestors with solemn expressions, military uniforms, ladies with high braids and lace fans. But none stood out like the final painting on the north wall. A woman with a harmonious face, skin like porcelain, and soft lips curved into the faintest of smiles. She wore ivory white, lace at the sleeves and a necklace of emeralds at her throat. It was the late Countess. The portrait wasn't just another decoration. It was framed in aged gold, set atop a marble pedestal, flanked by two candlesticks. It needed no plaque to announce her identity. That woman, lifeless for 3 years, still ruled the house with her beauty preserved in oil. Rosamund felt the painted eyes upon her, not with hatred but with pity. As if the woman knew, from her eternal perch, the uncomfortable place her successor now occupied. A short, stern-faced maid approached. "Jacinta," she said flatly without curtsying. "Follow me." They climbed a narrow staircase, crossed a tight corridor, and arrived at a modest room furnished with aged pieces. The bed was firm without canopy. The curtains plain linen. There was a trunk, a single chair, a porcelain wash basin with a crack across it, and a small writing desk near the window. Through the glass, Rosamund could see a patch of neglected garden, dry and overgrown. Breakfast is served at 6. The Earl takes lunch alone. Dinners, unless there are guests, are served early. There is no reading service. Ladies do not stroll alone. Rosamund nodded. She asked nothing. Jacinta lingered a moment as if expecting a complaint, a tear, a demand. When none came, she frowned and left. Alone, Rosamund unpacked her bag. She laid out 3 dresses on the bed. One dark gray, one moss green, and one midnight blue. None were new. Each had been altered by her own hand, the mending thread carefully matched in color. She took out a small locket, a mother-of-pearl comb, a psalm book with gilded edges, and a white handkerchief embroidered in lavender thread with the initials R.A. She sighed and sat before the mirror. But she did not look at herself. She already knew what she would see. Instead, she studied the reflection of the window. The day was beginning to fade. The sky, a dull leaden gray, seemed weighed down by the same sorrow that clung to the manor's walls. A knock at the door. A girl of about 11 stood in a linen apron. "Miss Jacinta says to come down to the dining room. There's lamb broth tonight. The Earl will dine in his study." Rosamund descended alone. The dining hall lacked all warmth. A long, dark wooden table, silverware set only at one end, and a chandelier lit out of pure habit. She sat without hunger. The broth tasted like boiled water. She asked for nothing more. Upon returning to her room, something changed. Matteo, the Earl's son, was there, standing silently in the doorway. He said nothing. He didn't look curious or afraid, only puzzled. His eyes were large like his father's but lighter, untainted by years of disappointment. "Are you the new one?" he asked, voice soft. Rosamund didn't know what to say. She gave a small smile. "I'm Rosamund," she replied gently, making no attempt to claim a title. "You may call me whatever you like." The boy didn't approach. He stared for a moment longer, then looked down, turned around, and left without a word. Rosamund closed the door quietly. That child, without knowing it, had been the only one to acknowledge her by name. She did not sleep that night. She listened to the house breathe, a clock chiming the hours with low solemn notes, footsteps echoing down the distant hallway, the wind slipping through poorly sealed shutters. The shadow of the late countess stretched across the walls, not as a threat, but as an undeniable presence. And yet, in the heart of that icy silence, Rosamund knew one thing with absolute clarity. She had not come here to surrender. She would not be the submissive wife they expected, nor the ornamental figure stored away in the south wing. If she could no longer win hearts with her face, she would do so with her dignity. If no one planned to see her, she would make them hear her. For even shadows, when constant enough, leave a mark. And she had not come into this world to leave no trace. Morning unfolded shyly over the fields of Greystone Hall, its light not yet warm enough to chase the chill from the stone walls or to lift the scent of damp from the air. The servants had already begun their day, distant voices in the kitchen, hurried footsteps in the corridors, and the rhythmic clanging of the well echoed like the workings of an ancient mechanism, silent and precise. Rosamund awoke without being summoned. She had long since learned to live without noise, without expectations, without complaint. She dressed in a plain linen skirt, a long-sleeved blouse with a square neckline, and tied her hair back with a faded blue ribbon. There was no mirror in her room, but she had no need of one. That day, like so many others, would slip through the hours with the resignation of someone trained not to take up space. And yet, something in the dawn called her outside. Perhaps it was the softness of light seeping through the window, or the quiet need to breathe air not pressed by confinement. She crossed the side gallery in silence, as if fearing the echo of her own footsteps might shatter the delicate rhythm of the house. No one stopped her. She reached the garden, or what once had been one. There, among dry brambles and abandoned flower beds, lingered traces of faded beauty. Untended rose bushes, lavenders drowned in dust, jasmine long since withered. The marble statues were cloaked in moss and fissures, as if the death of the previous countess had stripped the garden of its soul. Rosamund stepped carefully between the stones, as though walking through a graveyard of forgotten things. At the far end, a wrought iron bench still stood, flanked by the brittle remains of bougainvillea. She sat, closed her eyes, and inhaled deeply. For a moment, she could almost hear the laughter of an elegant woman, the voice of a child running along the paths, the distant notes of a piano. She didn't know how much time had passed until a rough voice pierced the stillness. "If you plan on sitting there long, you'd best bring a cushion. That bench has been cold as stone for as long as I can remember." Rosamund opened her eyes. A woman with snow-white hair, braided thickly down her back, stood watching from the path. She carried a basket on one arm and wore a worn apron over a dark dress. Her face was a map of deep lines, but her eyes, dark and sharp, had lost none of their fire. "Name's Tomasa. Been tending the kitchen since before the Earl grew into his boots. You must be the new lady." Rosamund nodded with a slight tilt of her head. "I have no title in this house, Mrs. Tomasa. But I'm pleased to meet you." The older woman arched a brow, amused. Then were two without titles. And without fear. In the days that followed, Rosamund returned to the garden each morning. At first timidly. Then with quiet resolve. She began clearing away dead leaves with her own hands, cutting dried stems, digging small holes with a borrowed trowel. She asked no permission. She needed none. She understood that as long as she did not disrupt the estate's function, she could move freely, another quiet shadow among many. The earth was dry, cracked. But it still responded. With Tomasa's help, and later that of Mr. Gilmore, the soft-spoken foreman with broad hands, Rosamund began shaping a small new corner of life. Not grand, not showy, but hers. She planted marigolds, basil, and pansies. Humble flowers. But hardy. At first, the workers remained indifferent. But slowly they began to watch her with new eyes. They didn't see her as a countess, nor as a lady, but they saw her. And for Rosamund that was a beginning. That fragile harmony, however, did not last. One afternoon, returning from the lower fields with a basket full of clippings, she heard raised voices beyond the barnyard. She paused behind a grapevine and watched quietly. There, beneath the shadow of an old fig tree, Mr. Pruden, the estate's steward, was berating one of the younger stable hands. "I didn't hire you to ask questions, boy," the steward barked, lifting the slender cane he always carried. "Things are done my way on this land, and if you don't like it, grab your hat and be off." The young man, fists clenched and eyes lowered, said nothing. Silence was his only shield. Mr. Pruden snorted in disgust and added, "Everything's gone soft since that woman died. Now everyone thinks they have a say." That phrase, "that woman," struck Rosamund like a thorn. He hadn't spoken the late Countess's name. There was no sorrow in his tone. Only disdain. A chill disrespect that did not match the reverence everyone claimed to hold for the departed lady. Rosamund stepped away without a sound. His words were not only harsh. They were dishonorable. That night young Matthew fell ill. A sudden fever drained the color from his cheeks and left him shivering in his bed. Jacinta, concerned but too proud, did not know what to do. It was Tomasa who came to Rosamund in the dark. "The boy's burning up," she whispered. "And the master's away. I believe you ought to be there." Rosamund didn't hesitate. She climbed the north wing stairs with her heart pounding like a drum. Upon entering, she found the boy beneath layers of blankets, his face slick with sweat, the bedsheets tangled from restless dreams. She sat beside him, took a damp cloth, and began to cool his forehead with soft strokes. She murmured words no one had taught her, gestures born from instinct, from soul. Matthew did not call her mother. He said nothing. But he didn't push her away. Hours later, when the fever began to recede, Rosamund sensed a presence behind her. Nathaniel stood at the threshold. He said nothing. He watched with arms crossed, unmoving, uninviting. The lamplight cast a golden glow over Rosamund's profile. Her tousled hair, the tender way she adjusted the blanket over the boy's chest, the barely perceptible tremble of her breath. Something shifted in him. Not desire. Not fondness. Something else. Crack. A fine fissure that led in confusion. Rosamund did not see him. Not then. But she felt it. And though the flowers in the garden had yet to bloom, a seed, in silence, had already begun to take root. The sky loomed heavy over Greystone Hall, thick clouds hanging as if time itself had paused mid-sigh. The air held that faint scent of damp paper and old wood, an aroma only preserved in homes marked by absence. Inside, the corridors remained in their usual dimness, barely disturbed by the silent movements of the maids. Though winter had not yet been declared, it could already be felt deep within the bones of the walls. Rosamund walked cautiously through the north wing's gallery. The house no longer felt like a maze to her, but rather a body riddled with wounds. Not visible ones, but ones sensed in every corner, in the unused rooms, in the locked doors, in the glances that refused to meet her own. Jacinta had, with little enthusiasm, assigned her the task of sorting through old fabrics stored in the former sewing room. "There are trunks no one has touched since the lady passed," she had said, offering no further explanation. Rosamund accepted without question. She knew her access to certain parts of the house was still a privilege, not a right. The sewing room lay at the end of the corridor, just before the library. The brass doorknob was covered in dust. As she turned it, the creaking door gave way with a sound like a forgotten breath. Inside, the air stood still, the kind of stillness found only in places where no one breathes. Light streamed in obliquely through a tall window, catching particles in the air that danced slowly, like memories suspended. A table covered by a white sheet stood in the center, surrounded by shelves with rolls of lace, spools of thread still hanging from their frames, and an oval mirror that offered a blurred image of herself. In the corner, beneath a knitted blanket, was a small cedar chest. It had no lock. Rosamund opened it gently, as if afraid to disturb a dream. Inside were unfinished embroidery pieces, scraps of muslin, a pale blue ribbon embroidered with pearls, and tucked beneath them all, a small wooden box with golden clasps, no bigger than a book. The hinges creaked faintly as it opened. Within lay a bundle of letters tied with a satin cord. Some had been opened, their ink faded with time. Others, carefully folded and still faintly perfumed. And one, just one, remained sealed. Rosamund picked it up with trembling hands. The envelope was thick, ivory-colored paper. On the back, the wax seal still intact bore the letter V, encircled by a crown of flowers. There was no mistaking it, it was a letter from the late Countess. On the front, in a firm and elegant script, was a single name, Nathaniel. Her pulse pounded in her temples. She sat on the edge of the table, the letter resting in her lap. She ought not to read it. She mustn't. But she also couldn't leave it behind. That sealed, untouched envelope seemed to whisper that whatever it held was not meant to remain buried. After several minutes frozen in stillness, she rose, slipped the letter into the hidden pocket of her skirt, and closed the box. She arranged the contents of the chest exactly as she had found them and left the room without a sound. That night, the letter was wrapped in an embroidered handkerchief and hidden at the bottom of her sewing box. The days that followed passed with a strange slowness. Every corner of the manor seemed to sense that Rosamund now carried a secret she didn't yet know how to name. The portrait of the late countess in the gallery seemed to regard her differently, more sternly, more present. And yet, amid that unease, something warm had begun to bloom in the unlikeliest of places. Matthew, the Earl's young son, no longer avoided her. At first it was subtle. He would watch her quietly when she passed through the corridor. He left smooth stones on the table for her, gathered from the garden. One day, seeing her water the plants, he shyly offered a sprig of mint. One morning, while she stitched on the gallery bench, the boy approached with quiet steps. He sat beside her without asking. He said nothing for a long while, only watched as her needle moved deftly as though she weren't just sewing thread, but unspoken words. "Are you going to stay?" he asked at last without looking at her. "If you'll have me," she replied without lifting her eyes from the fabric. He said nothing more. Then, in a whisper barely above breath, he murmured, "Mother?" Rosamund felt something shatter inside her. She didn't answer. She didn't dare. She only kept sewing, though her hands had begun to tremble. As expected, word soon reached the Earl. Nathaniel entered the gallery just before nightfall. He still wore his riding hat and boots caked with mud. His expression was composed, but there was a tension beneath the surface more unsettling than any shout. "What happened with my son?" he asked without preamble. Rosamund stood slowly. Despite the storm within her, her gaze remained steady. "Nothing happened." The boy spoke. "That is all. You called yourself his mother?" "No, sir," she replied, her voice low but firm. "I did not. He called me that. And I am not one to deny him comfort." Nathaniel pressed his lips together. He walked toward her with deliberate steps. The space between them could have been measured in breaths. His eyes bore into hers with hard scrutiny. "Don't mistake your place. This house has no need of someone stealing affection." Rosamund did not look away. Her cheeks flushed. Her lips taut. "And does this house need, then, a tomb where no one breathes?" The words hung in the air. Nathaniel stepped back half a pace. The silence between them had become a taut wire, on the verge of snapping. "I won't allow you," he said, "to use the boy to justify your presence here. And I won't allow you," she answered, "to use your absence to justify your coldness." It was the first time Nathaniel had no reply. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Not with desire. Not with anger. But with bewilderment. As if roused from a long sleep. Rosamund turned and left without waiting for permission. She climbed the stairs, entered her room and shut the door. Only then did she release the breath she had held. Her heart pounded. Her throat burned. But she did not cry. That night, alone in her chamber, she lit a candle and opened her sewing box. There was the letter. Untouched. Silent. Its mere presence seemed to thicken the air around her. She held it in her fingers. Turned it over. Set it down on the desk. She did not open it. She sat before it and stared for a long time. What might it hold? Farewell? A confession? A secret never meant to be revealed? In the candle's flickering light, the Countess's handwriting still seemed alive. The envelope, though yellowed, had not lost its grace. Rosamund placed a hand over her heart, as if to still the storm within. And for the first time since arriving at Greystone Hall, she allowed herself a doubt she had never dared voice. What if that letter didn't just change what she knew about Nathaniel, but also what she knew about herself? Noon fell over Greystone Hall beneath a sun that shone without warmth, casting long, thin shadows like silent warnings. The country breeze carried with it dry dust and the faint, medicinal scent of eucalyptus. The servants moved with more haste than usual, the gates had been opened early, and the dining room was being set with china that hadn't been used in years. The news had arrived with the weight of a decree. Lady Constance Langley, Dowager Marchioness of Windermere, was on her way. Rosamund's aunt. No one had announced her visit. Her carriage burst through the front drive with the same imperious clatter that always accompanied her entrances. From behind the window, her sharp face, veiled in black and shaded by a wide hat adorned with wine-colored feathers, peeked out as though inspecting enemy territory. She brought with her a single leather trunk and a maid who looked more like a compliant shadow than a companion. Rosamund descended the south wing staircase the moment she heard the wheels screech. Not out of desire but out of duty. Not out of affection but out of caution. She knew her aunt's presence never brought comfort despite the name. Lady Constance alighted with the help of the coachman, offering him no thanks. She wore black velvet, fastened with mother-of-pearl buttons and stiff lace at the wrists. Her gloves were white lace, as tight as her expression. "You're late, Rosamund," she said upon seeing her. "And without a hat." Rosamund dipped her head in a restrained greeting. "I wasn't expecting your visit, Aunt." "Of course not. True visits are never announced. They impose themselves." Nathaniel appeared then as if summoned from the very stones. He offered a stiff bow and kissed the Marchioness's gloved hand. "My lady," he said, "it is an honor to receive you at Greystone." "The honor is mine, my lord. I've come to see for myself the state of this rather unconventional union." The phrase hung between them like a finely honed blade. Nathaniel said nothing. Rosamund lowered her eyes, not from shame but from pride. She had learned that with certain women, silence was the only dignity one could preserve intact. The rest of the day, the Marchioness installed herself in the East Wing's blue chamber, demanding orange blossom water for her nerves and a special infusion only Mrs. Tompkins knew how to prepare. Her presence spread through the house like the scent of something long past its bloom. She ordered the drawing-room flowers changed, criticized the tapestries in the gallery, and regarded the small improvements Rosamund had made to the garden with disdain. "Too wild," she murmured, "like someone trying to beautify a battlefield." When evening came, a more elaborate supper than usual was served. Candelabras lit, embroidered linens, wine brought in from St. Albans. Rosamund was seated to Nathaniel's right as her title required, though the gesture felt more like a concession than an honor. Lady Constance presided over the table with a straight spine, a clear voice, and a face painted with restraint, like an actress who knew her part by heart. She spoke of politics, lineages, recent scandals in London. And when silence seemed ready to settle, she struck. "I must confess," she said, swirling her glass between her fingers, "I never imagined seeing my niece at such a table. I always assumed she'd end up in a convent, or tending wilted roses in some forgotten corner of the world." Nathaniel swallowed with difficulty. Rosamund, however, met her aunt's gaze with a calm she hadn't known she possessed. "And yet here I am," she replied, her voice steady. "At this very table." "Yes," the Marchioness said with a faint smile. "Here you are. Thanks to the generosity of a gentleman who evidently values other virtues." Nathaniel remained still. He said nothing to contradict her. Nothing to defend his wife. That silence, that absence of words, was more cutting than any of the Marchioness's barbs. A cold sting pierced Rosamund's chest. She clenched her napkin in her lap until it knotted in her fingers. But she did not break. At the meal's end, Rosamund excused herself with quiet grace. She climbed the stairs with firm steps, but once her chamber door closed behind her, she collapsed beside the bed. From her sewing box, she drew out an old letter. One written long before the marriage, addressed to her late mother. A letter never sent. In it, she had written of small hopes, her fear of solitude, and an innocent longing for happiness. She read it one final time. Then, bringing it to the candle flame, she watched it burn, page by page, until all that remained was ash. The tears did not come in a flood. They were discreet, restrained, like everything Rosamund was. Later that night, long after the house had gone to sleep, she stepped out of her room quietly. She was not seeking comfort or revenge, just air. But as she passed the corridor that led to the library, she heard voices. Low voices, edged with meaning. She stopped. "You shouldn't have come unannounced," said a deep voice. It was Mr. Pritchard, the steward. "Someone might talk too much." "Sometimes people need to be reminded that not everything is forgotten," came the Marchioness's reply, her tone soft but firm. "Especially when what's been buried could bring down the finest of names." There was silence. Then, a sentence that would linger in Rosamund's mind like a chill. "There are truths best left where they lie." She tiptoed away, her heart clenched. She didn't fully understand what she had heard, but something within her, an instinct honed by years of being invisible, told her those words concealed more than a secret. They concealed danger. She didn't sleep that night. The portrait of the late Countess in the gallery seemed more vivid than ever. The faint smile on her painted lips now looked like a warning. The Marchioness departed at dawn, leaving behind a musky perfume, a half-finished glass of wine, and a silence heavier than her presence. But she did not leave alone. She left behind a fracture. And Rosamund, unwittingly, had just peered into it. Afternoon descended over Greystone Hall with a deceptive stillness. The sky, streaked with veins of crimson and gold, hung suspended above the rooftops in a beauty that almost hurt. The air, thick from days without rain, carried that strange scent that speaks of something coming, something still unnamed. Rosamund had just finished watering her small garden corner, the one that had grown without permission but through sheer persistence. The jasmine had begun to show shy buds, and the marigold stood tall with colors that defied the dust. Her hands, covered in soil, bore proof that life could take root even where no one expected it. A rooster's call shattered the silence, followed by hurried footsteps. From the paddock gate, a maid cried out in a trembling voice, "Fire! In the stables!" Everything moved too fast. Far too fast. Rosamund dropped the watering can and ran. Smoke was already rising in gray columns behind the grove. People spilled from the kitchen, the workshops, the fields. Mrs. Jacinta shouted names. Mrs. Tompkins called upon the Virgin. Stable hands rushed with buckets and wet blankets while the horses whinnied frantically inside the wooden buildings already groaning under heat. Then, amid the chaos, a sharper cry pierced the air. A name. One word that changed everything. Matthew. Rosamund froze. "Where's the boy?" she cried, her voice torn. "I saw him go in with his little lamb," a young girl stammered. "He said he wanted to find it before bed." Rosamund didn't think. She didn't reason. She didn't ask permission. She gathered her skirt and ran through the smoke, dodged flames, crossed the half-collapsed rear entrance, and hurled herself into the stables, where darkness burned and the air scalded her lungs. The heat was unbearable. Smoke stung her eyes and turned each breath into torment. She pressed forward blindly, driven by a force she couldn't name. She tripped over a bucket, pushed aside a fallen beam, and then she saw him. Matthew, huddled in a corner, arms over his head, sobbing with the confusion of someone too young to grasp danger but old enough to feel it on every inch of skin. "Matthew," she whispered, voice shaking with fear and gentleness. "It's me. I'm here." The boy looked up. His eyes, full of ash and terror, recognized her and clung to her skirt like a castaway reaching shore. Rosamund gathered him in her arms. His small body was light, but the smoke, fatigue, and fire made every step feel heavier. The path back was blocked. Part of the roof had collapsed. A beam crashed nearby, and a spark scorched her sleeve, biting into the skin beneath. She didn't scream. She couldn't. She just clenched her jaw and pressed on. When the back door burst open again, amid shouts and water, Rosamund stumbled out, the child clutched tightly to her chest. She dropped to her knees the moment they crossed the threshold. Matthew was taken into safe arms. She, however, collapsed to the side, wrapped in smoke and pain. Nathaniel appeared at that moment. His boots cracked over smoldering cinders. He knelt beside her, lifted her in his arms without a word, and walked resolutely toward the house. His face, usually composed, was twisted in a way no one had ever seen. A blend of fear, astonishment, and something older. Something long dormant. Rosamund never lost consciousness, but she let herself be carried. The burning in her arm was sharp, the pain almost unbearable. Her face rested against Nathaniel's chest. The scent of his coat, the pounding of his heart, the brush of his beard against her forehead, it all felt more real than the world itself. He brought her not to her distant room but to the master bedchamber. There, between clean sheets and cloths soaked in vinegar, her healing began. For 2 days, Nathaniel never left her side. He called no one, trusted no one else. He changed her bandages with his own hands, offered her water patiently, and stroked her hair when the pain made her tremble. On one of those windless evenings, when the sky turned pale pink above the still smoldering fields, she awoke to find him sitting beside her, elbows on his knees, face in his hands. "Are you burned too?" she asked, her voice hoarse. He lifted his head. His eyes were tired, and something in them had broken open. "No, but I don't feel whole." Rosamund turned her head toward the window. The light was soft. The garden was still there. The flowers that hadn't bloomed were holding fast. "I never dreamed of a grand life," she murmured. "Just a home where no one avoided my face. A man who'd speak to me gently. A child who'd say my name without shame. I thought they were small dreams. Now I see they were too big for me." Nathaniel moved closer. His shadow covered her. His voice came low like a breath. "They weren't big. They were fair. And I failed to see them." Rosamund closed her eyes. A single tear slid down, not from the pain in her arm, but from the tenderness she'd been denied for too long. Nathaniel continued without touching her. My wife, my first, died with words in her mouth I never understood. I always thought she blamed me for her sorrow. And out of pride I never asked what hurt her. I buried myself in duty and control. I thought that was enough. Until I lost her. Until I lost this house's soul. And now you think you can get it back? He looked at her. For a moment it seemed he would say more. But he didn't. He only lowered his gaze. I don't know. But if there's one thing I can promise, it's that I won't stay silent again. Rosamund turned with effort. She met his eyes, and in that instant she didn't see the Duke. She saw the man. A man beginning to shed the marble he wore like armor. That night, when sleep finally claimed her, it came not with anguish, but with a rare calm. And in her south wing chamber, quiet and dim, the sewing box still waited. When Rosamund returned to it days later, the sealed envelope was still there. Untouched. Silent. But changed. She held it between her fingers. It felt heavier now. It was no longer just a letter. It was a threshold. And beyond it, perhaps, a truth that could alter everything. But it was not yet time to open it. Because even in the midst of smoke, of pain, of fear, something had begun that needed no words to exist. A promise. And that promise had already begun to burn. The wind blew from the north that morning, carrying with it the dry scent of fallen leaves and the constant murmur of the poplars lining the road. Greystone Hall seemed asleep, but not at peace. There was a heaviness in the air, as though something was simmering beneath the foundations. Something not yet brave enough to show itself, yet unwilling to stay hidden. Rosamund awoke with that weight in her chest. It wasn't fear nor nostalgia. It was a dull discomfort, as though the invisible threads of the house had tightened overnight. She sat up slowly, careful not to strain her still bandaged arm. The burn was healing, though what hurt more was the silence that followed what had been lived. The silence that lingers after brushing death and not knowing what to do with what remains. She descended the stairs slowly. From the kitchen came the familiar sounds of clanging pots and clipped voices. Mrs. Tompkins was steeping chamomile. Mrs. Jacinta gave instructions in the sharp tone she reserved for overcast days. Nathaniel was not in the house. One of the stable boys had said he left at dawn for the upper fields. Matthew was playing in the library. Rosamund found him surrounded by old books, cheeks stained with ink, fingers dusty. He held in his lap an enormous Bible, worn binding, gilded edges, the sort that held not only scriptures but family secrets written between its pages. "This book has my name in it," the boy said without looking up. She approached, curious. "Where did you see it?" Matthew pointed to a thick page between the Gospels and the Psalms. There, written in firm script, was the de Sorrel family tree. One name stood out, penned in a different hand, more delicate, more precise, unmistakably feminine. Like a whisper slipped between the lines. For Nathaniel, if ever you seek the truth, look where the light does not reach. See. Rosamund felt her breath hitch. That phrase, nearly hidden among the names, seemed to belong to no one, yet it said everything. She picked up the Bible gently, held it to the light. The ink was faded but still legible. It was not recent. It was no accident. That note had been there long before the late Duchess died. "Matthew," she asked softly, "may I take this for a moment?" The boy nodded with a shrug and returned to his carved wooden figurines without protest. Rosamund left the library with the Bible pressed to her chest. She climbed to the attic, her sewing retreat and quiet refuge, and locked the door behind her. The phrase was clear. The light does not reach certain places. But where in this house did the light truly fail? She thought of the sealed rooms, the shuttered corridors, the southern tower chambers no one cleaned and which Mr. Pritchard seemed to guard with excessive zeal. She also remembered the still sealed letter in her sewing box. The same tone. The same silence. A warning wrapped in painful grace. From that day on, Rosamund began to watch more closely. And to listen. Mr. Pritchard was different. More irritable. He moved faster through the halls, avoided the servants' eyes, and spent long hours shut away in the estate office. When Rosamund requested to review the pantry inventories, he refused with a vague excuse. "Numbers are not your concern, madam," he said, smiling a smile that never reached his eyes. "Best to trust that all is in order." But something in his voice was off. Stage. Practiced. Days later, as she walked toward the west wing, Rosamund attempted to open a door that had always remained slightly ajar. This time it was locked. As she turned the knob, a voice halted her. "You cannot go in there." It was Mr. Pritchard. He had emerged from the hallway like a ghost. His face pale, his pupils wide. "That's the old portrait room," he added. "It's disused. Too much dust." Not suitable for you. Rosamund stared at him for a long moment. She didn't argue. She didn't insist. But something inside her marked that reaction like ink on parchment. That night, the portrait of the late Duchess in the main gallery seemed different. There was something in her painted eyes. A melancholy Rosamund had never noticed before. As if that woman, forever trapped in oil and guilt, had longed to speak, and finally found someone willing to listen. Rosamund stood before her in silence. "Where is your truth?" she whispered. "What did you keep to yourself?" The chandelier flickered with a current of air. The portrait's shadow shifted as though the figure breathed. The next morning, Rosamund descended to the cellar. She knew the corners of the house well, but there were places she'd never dared enter. That day, something pulled her deeper. Between wine barrels and crates of wheat, she found a low door hidden behind a shelving unit. Opening it, the scent of old confinement made her stomach turn. She entered with a lamp. Dust hung thick. The walls wept dampness. And there, at the far end, under a white sheet, she found a portrait. She pulled it back slowly. The painting showed the Duchess in her youth, wearing a different gown than in the official portrait, seated before a window that did not exist in the house. In her lap she held a book. The same book. The same Bible. In the bottom corner of the canvas, nearly invisible, a phrase was written in the tiniest of letters. "What is hidden shall bloom beneath the judgment of the just." Rosamund stepped back, heart pounding. That woman had left a trail, in letters, in books, in brushstrokes. A trail for someone willing to look beyond the varnish. She left the cellar with the painting wrapped in cloth. No one saw her. She hid it in the attic beside the Bible. That night she barely slept. In her dreams, she heard the voice of Lady Constance echoing her venomous warning. There are truths better left where they lie. But now that phrase wasn't a warning. It was a confession. Seated in the gloom, Rosamund understood that the silence in that house was not only sorrow, it was defense. A shield to protect the guilty. To bury truth behind thick walls and obedient servants. And she, the wife without a face, the woman without a name, the shadow without weight, was beginning to see. Truly see. See what others pretended not to know. And once you've seen, you cannot close your eyes again. The morning broke with a deceptive clarity. The sky, calm and pristine, seemed to deny the tremor that ran beneath the foundations of Greystone Hall. The house was still, yes, but not at peace. It was a tense stillness, held breath, like that of someone on the verge of speaking a truth that can never be taken back. Rosamund had been awake long before the light. For hours, she had lain motionless in the darkness, staring at the ceiling without seeing it, her eyelids burning, her throat dry. Time felt suspended, as if the clock itself had refused to strike the hour that would end a wait too long endured. The letter. She had slept with it between her hands, as though her body's warmth might shield it from the weight of what it contained. But the envelope remained sealed. The wax untouched. The handwriting unwavering. Nothing had changed on the outside. Only she had changed within. She rose without lighting the lamp. Sitting at her desk, she struck a match with trembling fingers and lit the candle. Then she placed the letter on the wood. For a long moment she simply looked at it. Then slowly she picked up a paper knife and broke the seal. The sound was soft, but final. The page, folded in thirds, carried a faint scent of lavender and the composed penmanship of a woman who wrote with the full awareness of what she was revealing. "Nathaniel, if this letter reaches your hands, it means I could not tell you with my voice. Perhaps I didn't want to. Perhaps I didn't know how. But the truth I have discovered fills me with fear. Not for myself, but for you, for Matthew, for the history you still have the chance to save. The steward, Mr. Pritchard, has been embezzling funds. He's falsified the ledgers, secretly sold portions of the harvest, and manipulated the accounts. I found out by accident, going through documents that were misplaced. When I confronted him, he swore it was all for the good of the estate. He spoke with a calm that chilled my blood. Since then I felt watched. I hear footsteps when no one's there, doors opening without cause. And you, so distant you do not see. You refuse to see. If anything happens to me, do not look for illness where there is betrayal. And never again trust silence. Sometimes silence can kill too. See." Rosamund froze. The candle flickered, as if the flame itself hesitated to remain a light in the presence of such revelation. She closed her eyes. The words carved themselves into her skin. This wasn't just a confession, it was a cry. A plea from beyond the grave. The late Duchess had died in fear. And no one had seen it. Rosamund descended the stairs with unwavering steps. She sought no one. She went straight to the Duke's study, where he had returned only hours before from the fields. The door was ajar. Nathaniel was seated near the window, his face shadowed by the fading afternoon light. She didn't knock. She entered. He looked up. At the sight of her, his expression shifted from confusion to foreboding. "I need to speak with you," she said plainly. "And it won't be easy." Nathaniel rose slowly. He capped his inkwell with mechanical precision and stepped forward. "I'm listening." Rosamund held out the letter. "Your wife wrote this. I found it among forgotten papers. I didn't know whether to open it. But now I understand why she kept silent. Why she suffered. Why she died with a silence you mistook for surrender." Nathaniel took the letter. He read it without a word. As he read, his expression changed. His mouth hardened. His eyes, usually unreadable, darkened with a shadow Rosamund had never seen before. When he finished, he closed his eyes and pressed the letter to his chest. "No," he whispered. "It can't be." "It is," said Rosamund. "Pritchard betrayed your trust. And you, out of pride, habit, distance, you failed to see what was before your eyes. You didn't ask. You didn't listen. You didn't protect her." Nathaniel staggered slightly, bracing both hands on the desk. "I thought she was ill, fading slowly. She never told me this. Because she stopped trusting you. Because you stopped seeing her." The silence between them deepened. It hurt. Nathaniel looked up. His eyes brimmed, but no tears fell. "And you?" he asked, his voice cracked. "Why are you telling me this? Why didn't you use it against me?" Rosamund took a long breath. "Because I didn't come to this house to destroy it. I came to understand. To live with dignity. And because I will not repeat the story of a woman who died waiting to be heard." Nathaniel straightened. He walked to the door, summoned a servant and requested that Mr. Pritchard be brought at once. His voice held the authority of command, but also the tremor of a man awakening from a long deceit. The steward entered not long after. He walked in with his usual composure, but halted when he saw Rosamund and the letter in the Duke's hand. "Is something urgent, sir?" he asked, his tone unchanged. Nathaniel looked at him as though he were a stranger. "Yes, quite urgent. You are dismissed. Effective immediately. The guards will escort you from the estate. You are not to return." Pritchard paled. He opened his mouth to protest, but Nathaniel cut him off. "I've read enough. You need not defend yourself. Your lack of conscience is not worth the breath." The steward stepped back. His gaze flicked to Rosamund, sharp and fleeting. Then he turned and walked out without another word. Once the door closed, Nathaniel sank into his chair. The letter slipped onto his lap. "I killed her," he murmured. "Not with my hands. With my silence. With my indifference. And you. I nearly destroyed you the same way." Rosamund knelt before him. Took his hands. "You didn't kill her. You abandoned her without meaning to. Just as you did with me. But you can still choose differently. You can still change." Nathaniel looked up. At last he truly saw her. And for the first time, without titles, without duty, without borrowed names, he looked at her as one might look upon a truth too deep to ignore. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say, "Thank you." He made no promises. But in his eyes, for the first time, there was something new. Humanity. And a guilt that, perhaps, was ready to begin making amends. The days following Mr. Pritchard's departure were strangely silent at Greystone Hall. It was as if the very air, freed at last from the quiet poison that had lived within its walls, needed time to find its rhythm again. No one uttered his name. No servant dared speak of what had transpired. And yet, glances spoke more than lips dared whisper. Nathaniel left the morning after the confrontation. He gave no explanation. At first light, he ordered his horse to be saddled, took a small travel satchel and set off toward the southern hills, where the old hunting lodge, once his father's refuge, still stood hidden among the pines. Rosamund watched him depart from the gallery. She made no attempt to stop him. She knew this was not flight but mourning. And sometimes grief needs space to ache without witness. For 3 days the house floated in a different stillness. Matthew asked few questions, but more than once sought Rosamund's eyes with that quiet urgency only children can hide behind their games. Jacinta, less severe than usual, brought her herbal teas without request. Tomasa folded her linen with unusual care. The wind had shifted. The garden, newly green, seemed to breathe more freely. On the 4th day Rosamund rose at dawn. She dressed in a dark green linen skirt, a thick cotton blouse, and wrapped herself in a woolen cloak. Her hair was tied in a low bun and she wore sturdy boots. She left without escort, without announcement, and set out on the mountain path with determined steps. She knew where she was going. And why? The lodge stood among fir trees, surrounded by moss and fallen branches. It was small, just a stone and timber structure with a narrow chimney and a modest porch. Smoke still rose from the hearth inside. The fire was burning. Nathaniel was there. Rosamund did not knock. She pushed the door gently and entered. The scent of wood, earth, and solitude filled the space. Nathaniel sat before the fire, his sleeves rolled up, his face unshaven, his gaze lost in the embers. It took him a few seconds to lift his eyes. When he saw her, he did not startle. He merely blinked as though unsure whether he was dreaming. "I thought you wouldn't come," he murmured. "I thought you wouldn't want me to," she replied. He stood. In the reddish shadows cast by the flames, he seemed more human than ever. There was no nobility in his posture, no coldness in his expression, only a man bowed beneath the weight of his own conscience. "I don't know how to begin," he said, his voice unsteady. "I don't know if there are enough words to mend what I destroyed through silence." Rosamund looked at him for a long time, then walked to the window and paused by the frame. The filtered light, soft through the trees, fell across her face like an old, familiar touch. "I didn't come for words," she said. "I came for truth." Nathaniel stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away, his hands hanging at his sides like he no longer knew what to do with them. "I thought I knew you from the first day," he said. "I saw you as a burden, a punishment I deserved. And every day your face reminded me of what I thought I had lost. But it wasn't your face that wounded me, it was the mirror you held. Because you, Rosamund, you looked at me with a clarity I couldn't bear." She did not respond. She simply stood there, watching him, as if granting him the right to speak, but not the grace of absolution. "I judged you without knowing who you were. I failed to see the strength in your silence, the kindness in your gestures, the dignity with which you endured my contempt. And when I finally saw you, I feared it was too late." Rosamund stepped closer. Her eyes shone, not with tears, but with the fierce, quiet intensity of someone who has waited long without becoming lost in the waiting. "I did not come to demand anything," she said. "I came to decide. You once asked me to see you as a man. Now I ask, are you willing to see me as a woman?" Nathaniel raised his hand slowly as though afraid to break something. He brushed her cheek lightly with his fingers, not kissing her, not claiming her, only touching the certainty that for the first time he stood before her unarmed. "I cannot offer you a different past," he said softly, "but I can promise that the future will be yours as much as mine. If you choose to stay, you will not be my shadow. You will be my equal." Rosamund's heart surged, not at the promise but at the look in his eyes. Because at last Nathaniel saw her. Not as a wife, not as Matthew's stepmother, not as a rescued woman. He saw her soul. And that was all she had ever longed for. They did not embrace. They did not kiss. They simply stood before each other, feeling time slow to make space for something deeper. Rosamund nodded. "Then I'll return. But not to the southern wing. I'll return to the house. To my home. And if I return, it will be beside you, not behind you." Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment. He too nodded, not as one who yields but as one who finally recognizes a higher truth. When they returned to the estate days later, there was no grand announcement. But everyone knew something had changed. The Duchess had not returned as an ornament. She had returned as mistress of the house. And that shift echoed in every glance, every gesture. Meanwhile, in the city, Lady Constance Harrow struggled to reclaim her place in the parlors and salons of the peerage. But doors no longer opened as they once had. The leading ladies, aware of whispers and shadows, began to greet her with polite evasions. One morning she received a letter. It bore no official seal, no grand crest. Only a clear and unmistakable sender, Nathaniel Sterling. The note was brief, elegant, and final. He thanked her for past favors. He repaid, with interest, a debt once owed by his late father. And he asked, with the courtesy of a wounded nobleman, that she refrain from interfering again in the affairs of Greystone Hall. Lady Harrow did not reply. That same week, she withdrew from society. Some said she went to live with a distant cousin. Others whispered of illness. But when Rosamund heard of it, she did not smile. She only thought that some women also learned to lose, quietly. That night, as the wind stirred the branches of the elms and the moon cast silver light across the walls of the estate, Nathaniel stood before the portrait of his first wife. He did not ask forgiveness. He did not whisper promises. He only lowered his gaze. And when he climbed the stairs to the chamber where Rosamund now slept, he did so as one who had finally understood that to see is not merely to look, and that love begins the day one dares to see without fear. Spring arrived at Greystone Hall without fanfare, yet its signature bloomed in every new bud, in the longer trill of the finches, and in the warm scent rising from the moist earth at dawn. For the first time in a long while, the estate didn't merely function, it breathed. Walls once cold now echoed with laughter. Windows once shuttered now opened wide to the breeze. And the servants, who had once lowered their gaze before their masters, now looked them in the eye, with a blend of respect and quiet gratitude born only when fear gives way to dignity. Rosamund walked the corridors with purpose. She wore a pale blue cotton gown, three-quarter sleeves rolled with ease, her hair pulled into a low braid tied with a lavender ribbon. No jewels, no titled announcements. Her presence had become part of the soul of the house. In the gallery, spread across a long wooden table, lay illustrated books, spools of thread, shears and scraps of fabric. Around it, 5 country women of various ages repeated, with hesitant voices, the syllables Rosamund pointed to on the page. One of them embroidered while reading, as though stitching the words into memory as she learned them. "Don't worry about the mistakes," Rosamund would say with steady patience. "What matters is that no one can ever again tell you you're not capable. Because you are. And you will." The women's eyes sparkled, not for what they yet understood, but for what they were beginning to believe about themselves. What had started as a timid idea had become a ritual. Twice a week, women from the neighboring farms came to learn to read, to write, to sew with pattern and purpose. Some were young with hands cracked from the fields. Others were older, with hard eyes and noble bearing. What they all shared was a history of silence. And now, little by little, they were learning to give that silence a voice. Nathaniel observed from a distance. He no longer interfered. He had come to understand that transformation does not always come from command, but from allowing life to find its way. He himself had changed, quieter now, not from coldness but from reflection. At the far southern edge of the estate, near the glass house, the groundskeepers had been working for weeks on a plot long abandoned. Where once nettles and dry grass grew, Rosamund had asked for something else to be built. Not a hall, not a statue, a garden. But not just any garden. A garden for the unbeautiful. That was its name. That was its purpose. It would hold no perfect roses, no symmetrical lilies. It would bloom with wild daisies, tangled jasmine, bougainvillea climbing where it pleased, and sunflowers that turned boldly toward the light. Each plant would honor a woman once dismissed for failing to fit another's mold. The garden would be their voice, their space, their beauty. The day of the unveiling arrived with the song of blackbirds. It was a Sunday of clear skies and gentle sun. The celebration was modest. No invitations were sent to the city. No permission was sought from bishop or baron. It was a quiet act, but profound. The women from the workshop wove flower crowns. Matthew collected smooth stones from the river to line the path. Tomasa baked anise bread. Nathaniel had a wrought iron bench placed beneath the shade of an ash tree. Rosamund arrived wearing an ivory white dress, a mother-of-pearl brooch pinned at her chest, her lips touched with the faintest rose. She walked the path with hands folded and heart trembling. At the center she paused, took a deep breath. "This garden is not mine," she said, her voice steady. "It belongs to every woman who ever looked in the mirror and saw not what others hoped to find. It is for those called plain, awkward, odd, or invisible. It is for us, so that we may bloom, not in silence but with roots." No one applauded. But the silence that followed was reverent, moved. A silence that did not beg for clamor, only understanding. Nathaniel approached just as the sun began to tilt. He held a small velvet box. He opened it without flourish. Inside lay a simple ring, aged gold, with a stone clear as water. "I have no new words," he told her. "Only a new gesture. This ring is not to mark you as mine. It's to remind me I never want to walk without you." Rosamund looked at him. Her eyes did not fill with tears, they didn't need to. Everything she felt was already shining in the way she met his gaze. She held out her hand. Nathaniel slipped the ring on with care. The stone caught the last light of day as if it too drew breath. From beneath the shade of a lemon tree, Matthew watched. Then he ran to her, wrapping his arms around her legs and looking up with the innocent wonder only love can teach. "Now I really have a family," he whispered. Rosamund bent down and embraced him tightly, her eyes closed. Her heart pounded, not with fear but with life. The past hadn't vanished. The wounds were still there, soft scars beneath the skin. But the present was fertile. And the future, for the first time, no longer hurt to imagine. That night, as the garden slept under the moon, Rosamund stepped out onto the porch. She sat in the rocking chair she'd had restored and gazed at the horizon. The jasmine scent drifted on the breeze. The crickets sang as if rejoicing. Nathaniel emerged in silence and took the seat beside her. They did not speak. There was no need. Because sometimes true love doesn't begin with a promise. It begins with a gaze that finally sees. With a garden that finally blooms. And with a woman who, once called unbeautiful, learned to be unforgettable. 8 winters, and all their snow, had passed over the rooftops of Greystone Hall, but the heart of the estate still beat with the same quiet strength it had on the day everything changed. The seasons in their steady procession had not erased the past, but softened it. Like light falling across an old photograph, time had only brought shape to what had been lived, depth to each gesture, and meaning to every tear. Each morning Rosamund walked the garden she had once only dreamed of, now vibrant with life. The flowers still bloomed in harmonious disarray, like women who had learned to raise their voices without waiting for permission. That patch of fertile earth, born of rejection, had become a refuge for visitors from across the valley. Ladies of noble rank and farm girls alike paused to read the names etched into small bronze plaques, each one dedicated to a woman once ignored, silenced, or judged. The estate itself had transformed. What began as makeshift lessons had grown into a proper school, with teachers trained by Rosamund herself. Country women now learned trades, wrote letters, and managed household ledgers. Some had even started small businesses, earning the kind of respect once denied them. They were no longer just wives or maids. They were citizens. They were voices. Matthew, now 14, had grown into a bright and kind-hearted young man, with his father's eyes, but his mother's strength of character. He had become an older brother to 2 girls, Clara and Dorothea, born 3 years apart. The first was thoughtful and serene, with a quiet intelligence that often surprised her tutors. The second was a whirlwind of laughter, always barefoot, always muddy, always with a story on her lips. Nathaniel, whose temples were now streaked with silver, managed the estate with a balance of firmness and empathy. He never again closed the doors to his study when someone came with a question or concern. His authority remained undisputed, but no longer inspired fear. It inspired respect. In town, his name was spoken not for the power it carried, but for the change it symbolized. Inside the house, Rosamund and Nathaniel no longer called each other Duke or Duchess. They called each other by name. And on long nights, when the children slept and the corridor lamp flickered, they still shared wine and secrets, as if love had only just begun. It wasn't the love of their early days. It was something deeper, quieter. The kind of love that didn't need proving because it had proven itself over time. Not all had withstood the judgment of the years. Mr. Prentice, dismissed without scandal but with firm resolve, lived out his days in a distant village, isolated and ailing. No one ever truly heard from him again. Some whispered that he spoke to himself at night, repeating names no one recognized. He carried his burden to the end. And he paid, not with public disgrace, but with the invisible weight of guilt that offered no redemption. Lady Constance chose a different path. She moved abroad with her youngest daughter, searching for social circles where her name still held value. In time, the letters from Paris or Vienna grew fewer and eventually ceased. She was heard from only once more, a clipping in a foreign paper noting her presence at a gala, not as a guest of honor, but simply as a lady in attendance. Meanwhile, Tomasa still baked anise bread on Sundays. The chickens still fled from Clara. Dorothea still stole oranges. And Matthew had begun to write in a leather-bound journal, tales inspired by his mother, whom he considered the bravest woman in the world. One autumn afternoon, while dry leaves danced along the stone walkway, Nathaniel found Rosamund sitting on the steps of the family chapel. She held a small wooden box in her hands. "What's that?" he asked softly. She opened it. Inside lay the original letter from the late Duchess, now yellowed with age, and a single dried flower from the garden of the unbeautiful. "I was thinking of burying it here," she said. "Not to forget but to give thanks. She saved my life, through silence." Nathaniel knelt beside her. And without a word, he covered her hands with his own. The sunset wrapped around them in golden light. From the rear courtyard came the laughter of children. And in the distance, church bells began to mark the close of day. So ended the story of a woman the world had not deemed beautiful, but who transformed a legacy with the strength of her soul. A woman who had not been wanted, but was loved as few ever are. A woman who never begged for love, but earned it standing tall. And so, the surname that had once felt cold became legend. Because Greystone Hall was no longer the Duke's house. It was Rosamund's home. and the garden she had planted was still in bloom. There are stories that aren't just told, they are felt. Rosamund's is one of them. Not because it speaks of a rejected face or an inherited title, but because it speaks of dignity, of courage, of that kind of love that does not arise from instant desire, but from deep recognition, the kind only time and truth can bring forth. Rosamund showed us that one does not have to be beautiful to be loved, nor powerful to transform a legacy. She reminded us that tenderness is not weakness, that forgiveness can be an act of justice, and that sometimes true love comes not when we beg for it, but when we begin to demand respect. Cherry Blossom, if this story moved you, leave the word flower in the comments. That way I'll know you stayed with Rosamund until the very end, and that her garden bloomed in your heart as well. And don't go just yet. You'll find more stories linked here, tales filled with emotion, intrigue, and impossible love. Each one holds a world worth discovering. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening with your heart. And thank you for helping these stories reach even more souls. Because when we share emotion, that emotion grows. Speech Balloon, and you? What part of this story touched you the most? I'll be reading your comments.